Welcome to Policy Precision.
An unbiased dive into executive orders. I focus on the details, the history, the impacts.
And I connect policies to their human side. Today, we are doing a deep dive into Executive Order 14164.
That's right. It's officially titled Restoring the Death Penalty and Protecting Public Safety. Signed January 20th, 2025 by President Trump.
And it popped up in the Federal Register. That's the government's official journal, for those who don't know, on January 30th.
Yep, 90 FR 8463 if you want the precise citation.
So our mission today is really to unpack this order. What are its key parts, and what's the rationale given, inside the document itself? Where do we start?
Well, it kicks off with Section 1, labeled Purpose. And it doesn't waste any time setting its stance.
Okay.
It calls capital punishment an essential tool, essential for deterring heinous crimes, acts of lethal violence against citizens, and also as just punishment.
Right, and it immediately tries to ground this historically, doesn't it? Mentioning its use since the country's founding.
Exactly. Yeah. It leans on that history, framing it as proof it's needed for deterrence and, well, the only fitting response to extreme violence. It's presented as having this long-standing legitimacy.
Though, of course, the founders' actual views are complex and debated by historians.
Absolutely. But the order asserts their understanding was that capital punishment was key for justice, for restoring order against, quote, profound evil.
And then it jumps to the present day.
It does. It claims there's still broad popular support for it now.
And then it gets critical.
Very. It singles out politicians and judges who oppose it, accuses them of defying and subverting the laws by trying to stop executions.
Which definitely raises questions about, the separation of powers and legal interpretation.
Precisely. And it specifically names President Biden's actions.
Like what?
The DOJ's moratorium on federal executions framed here as maybe failing to uphold the law. And also the commutation of sentences for 37 federal death row inmates back in December 2024.
Ah, yes. And the order uses some really, really strong language to describe the crimes of those individuals, right?
It does. Extremely strong. Vile and sadistic rapists, child molesters, and murderers. It details specific acts, brutalizing children, strangling, drowning, hunting strangers. Stark descriptions.
Clearly meant to emphasize the administration's view on the severity, the monstrosity of those cases.
And the argument follows that commuting those sentences went against protecting victims, which the order says capital punishment provides for such, quote, barbaric acts.
It also takes aim at judges who say capital punishment is unconstitutional.
Right. The order pushes back hard, saying the Constitution itself acknowledges its legality, which, again, brings up that whole ongoing debate about constitutional interpretation.
It's a very forceful opening. How does Section 1 wrap up?
It concludes that efforts against capital punishment defy the laws, make a mockery of justice, and are an insult to the victims. It stresses the government's duty to protect citizens and says this administration won't tolerate hindering these laws.
Okay, so a really strong foundation laid out, then it moves to the actual policy changes.
Exactly. That brings us neatly to Section 2, policy. This bit is quite brief.
Okay.
It just states the policy is to ensure laws authorizing capital punishment are respected and faithfully implemented.
And does it mention those obstacles again?
Yes. It explicitly aims to counteract politicians and judges seen as obstructing executions. Reinforces that confrontational tone from Section 1.
Got it. So Section 3 must get into the nitty-gritty federal capital punishment.
That's where the action points start. Subsection A tells the Attorney General to pursue the death penalty for all crimes of severity demanding its use.
Severity demanding its use. That sounds a bit subjective. How is that defined?
The order doesn't specify the exact criteria there, which does raise questions about practical application. But subsection B gets more specific.
Yeah.
It identifies two categories of federal capital crimes where the Attorney General shall pursue federal jurisdiction and seek the death penalty regardless of other factors, as long as it's legally possible. A mandate, essentially.
Okay, and what are those two categories flagged for special attention?
First, the murder of a law enforcement officer. Second, a capital crime committed by an alien illegally present in the country.
Interesting. Those two specifically, why do you think they were singled out?
Well, the order doesn't explicitly say why, but it certainly suggests these are high-priority areas for this administration's law enforcement focus. It could reflect specific policy goals or maybe broader messaging.
And it doesn't stop at the federal level, does it?
No. Subsection C encourages state AGs and DAs to bring state capital charges, particularly for those same two categories, murdering police officers and crimes by undocumented immigrants. even if a federal trial didn't result in a death sentence or perhaps alongside federal efforts.
Wow, so a real push for capital punishment in those specific scenarios across jurisdictions.
Seems to be the goal, yes. Then subsection D is more administrative. It directs the Attorney General to update the Justice Manual, basically, the rule book for federal prosecutors to reflect this order's policy.
Makes sense. Got to get the guidelines in line with the directive.
Exactly. And subsection E circles back to those 37 individuals whose sentences President Biden commuted.
What about them?
The Attorney General is told to evaluate their imprisonment conditions
To evaluate how?
and to take lawful action to make sure their imprisonment reflects, and here's that strong language again, the monstrosity of their crimes and the threats they pose.
So, potentially making their conditions harsher.
That seems to be the implication. It also asks the AG to see if these individuals could potentially be charged with state capital crimes and to advise state and local authorities accordingly.
Right. It definitely feels like an attempt to revisit, maybe even undo some of the previous administration's decisions in that area.
It's a clear signal to re-examine those specific cases under this new policy framework.
Okay. What comes after the federal focus?
Section 4 turns to the states. Preserving capital punishment in the states.
How does it aim to do that?
Subsection A is significant. It tasks the Attorney General with taking action to ensure states that do have capital punishment have enough lethal injection drugs.
That's been a major practical hurdle for some states, hasn't it? Finding the drugs.
It has. So this directly addresses that logistical bottleneck that sometimes stops executions. Then subsection B give the AG power over state requests for certification under a specific law, 28 U.S.C. 2265, which relates to how federal courts review state capital cases.
Okay. Then Section 5 sounds like a big one. Seeking the overruling of Supreme Court precedents.
It really is. This is quite direct. It instructs the Attorney General to, quote, take all appropriate action to seek the overruling of Supreme Court decisions that limit the authority to impose capital punishment.
So actively trying to get the Supreme Court to revisit and overturn past rulings that restrict the death penalty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It signals a clear intent to challenge existing legal boundaries, potentially expanding where and how the death penalty can be applied. It raises major legal questions about precedent and the court's role.
A significant legal strategy outlined there. What's in Section 6?
Section 6 broadens the view slightly to prosecuting crime to protect communities. Subsection A tells the Attorney General to prioritize public safety, prosecuting violent crime, and also dismantling transnational criminal groups operating in the U.S.
So connecting capital punishment policy to a wider anti-crime agenda.
And subsection B encourages state AGs and DAs to adopt similar priorities and calls for more federal-state cooperation in law enforcement. A unified front, essentially.
Okay, almost there. Section 7 sounds like standard legal stuff.
It mostly is. General provisions. Subsection A says the order doesn't mess with the existing powers of other agencies or OMB, standard stuff.
Right.
Subsection B notes it must be implemented consistent with the law and crucially depending on available funding. Budgets matter. And subsection C is important legally. It states the order doesn't create any new rights or benefits that someone could sue over. Basically, you can't use this order itself as a basis for a lawsuit against the government.
Limits challenges. Okay, so let's try to wrap this deep dive up. What are the main takeaways from Executive Order 14164?
Well, first, a very strong statement of purpose. It leans on history, deterrence, and justice arguments to advocate for capital punishment.
And it follows that with clear policy directives, things like ensuring implementation, pushing back against perceived obstacles.
Then there are those specific actions for the Attorney General, pursuing federal death sentences, especially for murdering law enforcement and crimes by undocumented immigrants.
Plus, encouraging states to do the same in those cases, changing the Justice Manual, reevaluating those commuted sentences.
And the logistical support for states like the lethal injection drugs and that very significant push to challenge Supreme Court precedents.
Right. And finally, it frames all this within a broader context of prosecuting violent crime and federal-state cooperation before adding those standard legal caveats.
So when you step back and look at the historical context it invokes and the very clear intent laid out, it really prompts a question for you, the listener.
What might be the real-world long-term impacts legally, societally, of this executive order on how capital punishment is actually used across the United States? Something to think about.